Welcome to Sharp Again Naturally's April webinar. I'm Lisa Feiner, and I'll be your host this evening. We'd like to note that the information in this presentation is for educational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Our information is intended to empower patients, their families, and healthcare professionals who want to collaborate in the most effective ways on this journey to health and well-being. Please see a licensed and qualified medical professional for your medical needs. Before we begin, I'd like to share a Stay Sharp programming update with you. We have 2 coaching programs coming up. The Eating for Body and Brain coaching program begins on Friday, April 22nd, and it's one that I am co-leading with Samantha Anderson. We have just a few seats left. This group program focuses on how food affects our bodies and brains, why the gut microbiome is so important, and small steps we can take to enhance our cognitive health. Our next foundational coaching program begins Tuesday, May 3rd, for those looking to preserve their cognition or who are just beginning to notice lapses in their memory. This program focuses on how to take a more active role in managing nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress to enhance brain health. I'd like to invite our executive director, Sue Lynn, to say a few words.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I did want to talk a little bit about our Stay Sharp Foundational Coaching Program, which is starting on May 3rd. I spend a lot of time talking to our coaches and people who go through these programs that we host, and I cannot say enough good things about it. It is primarily for people who are looking to preserve their cognition, or those who are noticing what we call little blips. They're starting to notice that they're either being more forgetful or they're having trouble concentrating, but they're at the very beginning of any type of memory loss. The great thing about these programs is that they help you to have the tools that you need. If everybody could mute their microphones, it would really be appreciated. I'm sorry, I was saying about the programs, they really do help you kind of get the tools and information that you need to live your sharpest lives, to understand what you need to do to have the presence and the tools that you need to stay sharp. And the great thing about the coaches, the programs, is that you're not working only in a small group program, you're also working directly with health coaches. So the fee for the program is $79, but you cannot get a single session with a health coach for $79. Here you're getting 2 one-on-ones with a health coach so that you can put a plan in place that is personalized for you, as well as 6 sessions with the individuals who are in your group. We keep the groups limited to no more than 8 people, and they are focused around 4 key components of having your sharpest cognition: nutrition, sleep, stress, and what is the 4th one?
Exercise. Yeah.
Exercise. Sorry about that. So I highly advise you to go to our website. It's sharpagain.org, and you can learn more about the programs and register. And again, we keep these limited to 8 people, so registration is extremely limited. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. So I just wanted to let everyone know that our final winter spring webinar will be on Friday, May 20th at 11 o'clock Eastern time. And it's called The Social Connection and Brain Health with Dr. Robert Ketchko and Debbie Dralick. Join us for an intriguing talk on how social isolation impacts our brain health, and learn about some creative ways to connect as we continue to live with COVID. Our summer fall webinars will begin in July, and we'll put the registration information for that up in the chat box as well. So we'll go to the formal presentation this evening. Thank you for joining us for stress, trauma, and brain health. I'd like to welcome our speaker, of whom I'm very fond personally, Dr. Ilene Naomi Rusk. Dr. Rusk is the director of the Healthy Brain Program and the coordinator of the Cognitive Rehabilitation and Trauma Treatment Programs at the Brain and Behavior Clinic in Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Rusk completed a fellowship in neuropsychology while studying new treatment strategies for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's diseases. She has authored peer-reviewed papers in the areas of psychology, neuropharmacology, and neuroscience. More recently, Dr. Rusk trained extensively with Dr. Dale Bredesen and the Institute for Functional Medicine in using an integrative approach to treat the root causes of cognitive decline and dementia. Dr. Rusk has been asked to speak all over the world about mental health, brain healthy lifestyles, and neuroplasticity through the lifespan. Her personalized approach to brain health coaching, which incorporates her lifelong practice of meditation and training in trauma healing, inspires others to build emotional resilience into their optimal longevity plans. She supports the earliest initiation of mental wellness and healthy brain lifestyles and envisions a time when dementia is a rare occurrence. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we will answer them during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Please welcome Dr. Rusk.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure if I'm spotlighted.
Yes, you are now.
Great. I could see you, Lisa, which is a lovely thing. I just want to say I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm happy to be on the advisory board, I think it's called, of Sharp again. I'm very close to my heart, and even as you read the last line of my bio, I kind of became emotional because I do envision a world where there is much more brain health, and dementia is a rare occurrence.
And we share that with you.
I think so. So I realized I could have called this talk Building Brain Resilience During Crazy Times, but instead I called it something a little neater: Stress, Trauma, and Brain Health. It's a timely topic because our bodies, our minds, our whole framework for life has changed during this pandemic, and we're different than we used to be. And just as we began to think we were possibly slipping out of the pandemic, we were flooded with information about the war or the climate crisis. And I just want to say we're all sitting together here in our little Zoom squares, but behind those Zoom squares are tender nervous systems that have been through a lot. They've been bombarded, and we all need sanctuary and rest, and a feeling of confidence that peace and hope and deep health are available to us. So today I'm going to talk to you about stress and mental health and how they're intertwined. We need to address mental health and dementia prevention and treatment, especially now. We seem to think of them as separate, and we throw around this word stress without really knowing what it means emotionally, physiologically, personally. So I'm going to be addressing the role that mental health and stress play in dementia. And I just want you to know it's been a passion project, or shall I call it a passion profession for me for so many years, because our mental health ultimately determines all of the things we do in all of our therapy or coaching or exercise or diet. Treatment programs or interventions. We need mental health and mental wellness. So there's a lot of tender material in here, and you might kind of be curious at, well, that sounds really interesting. So I'm going to invite you to grab a pencil or a pen and maybe take some notes. And if you don't want to take notes, don't take notes. Just take in the material personally so that you feel like you're going to leave with one or two things to do, so that you don't feel like there are 11 things I'm talking about and you can't do 11, because that's really not how our behavior changes or our emotions change. It's like just a gentle long-term process that we commit to. So again, just take away one or two things. So next slide, please. So My interest is in dementia and in Alzheimer's and in prevention and treatment. But I just want to say we throw around words here. And for clarification, I just want to say that dementia is an umbrella term. Not everything is Alzheimer's disease. 70% of the dementias, it's estimated, are of the Alzheimer's type. And I could spend a whole kind of course talking to you about the different dementias and how they're different. But I feel early diagnosis is important so that we have a sense of what's really changing in your individual cognition, what's really changing in your individual life, so that you can tailor the enhancement of your life with these different coaching and intervention models, whether it's a functional medicine model or it's just a coach. So it's important to get a good diagnosis. And many of these conditions that I've listed, vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease, they often live together in the same brain. People with Alzheimer's often have vascular changes. There's frontotemporal dementia and Creutzfeldt-Jakob. You can see them on the right of that umbrella, and LBD is Lewy body disease. These are all forms, neurodegenerative illnesses that show up with dementia. But the one in the middle that says psychiatric, it really should say psychological mental health. Those often look like dementias, or they're warnings for cognitive change, but they're not indeed dementias. And next slide, please. And what about treatment? So I'll tell you a story. Lisa kindly introduced me, but I want to introduce myself and give you just a little bit of context. I started in this position looking through a microscope. I was an aspiring neuropsychologist. I joined a neurobiology lab in the 1980s, and I studied those neurotransmitters. And we used to get these tiny little packets of like raw paper with powder in them. They would be the specific pharmacologic agents that I was supposed to be testing in our lab to see if they reversed Parkinson's disease or they reversed Alzheimer's disease. Well, if it were only that simple, but it's not. And after 40 years of hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars on clinical trials and hundreds of clinical trials, we don't really have much to show in terms of altering the course of a dementia. So there's no silver bullet, but there are some new approaches. In 2014, there was an amazing paper that caught my eye when I was in my office in Colorado. Dr. Dale Bredesen, who was connected with UCLA at the time, I believe he still is, had just published a paper showing that he could reverse cognitive decline in people with Alzheimer's. Well, that was so amazing and exciting to me that I called him and I said, let's work together. And those of us in this field now are detectives using a functional medicine approach to look at root causes of cognitive decline. So we're now looking through this huge lens, next picture, and we're beginning to see the whole picture. Next slide. Thank you. And this is what we've learned. We've learned that we have to look at all of the contributors. So the new models, like looking through a huge lens at all of the possible contributors to this very complex illness like Alzheimer's or dementias. Next slide. Next slide, sorry, thanks. Oh, it's actually the roof with the leaky holes, the one before, that's right. So we liken the causes of Alzheimer's disease now to a leaky hole, a leaky roof with many holes. So there are many contributors to cognitive health and many contributors to cognitive decline. And that's now consistent with many studies, huge studies from many different countries showing that we can actually modify using lifestyle and biological factors. We can improve cognitive health, like the finger study and the active study. And anyone who wants more resources is going to have a chance to ask me questions and also write to me or Sharp again, and I'll provide you with resources happily. Next slide. Great. So this is a little map that I wrote. It's an illustration of all of the different contributors that you might be able to relate to in your life, because all of those ovals contribute to cognitive health. or cognitive decline. So in a way, this is a roadmap done with a functional medicine doctor, but working with some of these things, sometimes one at a time, sometimes three at a time. It's an opportunity to just take a slightly deeper dive to be able to have more management and control of your brain health. And for today's purposes, I'm not going to be talking about sleep or hormones or dental health or gum health. I'm going to just be focusing on mental health, stress, trauma, and different cognitive patterns that can contribute to cognitive decline. Next slide. So in many talks, functional medicine talks about reversing or treating or preventing dementias or cognitive decline, the things that are on the right-hand side that are in white, hormones, sleep apnea, toxins, the microbiome, infections, those are things that are often talked about, but I'm not going to be talking about any of those things today. I'm going to be talking about other root causes, and those root causes are things like maybe depression, grief, anxiety, adverse childhood experiences. Next slide. Thank you. And mental health is a direct contributor to brain health. There's this very strong relationship between mental health disorders and neurologic disorders later in life. And this gives us a mission and a purpose, a motivation to take care of our mental health, heal some of our old wounds or stress patterns, and make a positive change. Next slide. And it all begins in childhood. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but it's a very important root study. It's a study that showed us that we can really link back a lot of chronic illnesses to childhood. In the 1990s, a series of studies began at Kaiser Permanente in the States by Vincent Folletti, and it's become a very famous body of work. They were studying obesity, and they noticed that some people just kept putting weight back on. And when they finally studied those people who couldn't really reach those behavioral or health milestones, they found out that they had a lot of adverse things that had happened to them in their childhood. And it increases your risk for many illnesses. It doesn't mean that it's a one-to-one relationship. I have a colleague who has had many adverse childhood experiences. I too have had adverse childhood experiences. Everyone on this call now has had adverse childhood experiences. It's just the risk increases the more adverse childhood experiences you have. And there's a link now that I'm pulling together between our childhoods, the traumas and stresses we've had throughout our lives, and how our nervous systems kind of formed patterns that we can change, but that inform our brain health now. Next slide. So there are many chronic illnesses by famous people who've written books that are directly tied to trauma. Obesity, asthma, even PTSD, and how long you have PTSD for, or whether or not you get post-traumatic stress disorder, is often determined by your early childhood experiences, your traumas. Addictions are linked to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. And today we're going to just be talking a little bit about how dementia and other neurodegenerative disorders might have some roots in the patterning of our nervous systems. Next slide. And this is a slide showing that our adverse childhood experiences lead to kind of changes in our brain structure, actually, in the wiring and sculpting of our neurons early in life. And that can lead to problems in school, cognitive impairments, social impairments, maybe people who are not from very emotionally rich or healthy backgrounds and have a lot of adverse experiences. Maybe they don't take as good care of themselves. And maybe people who don't understand what it is to go to the doctor or have self-care might adopt risky health behaviors like smoke or drink a lot. That leads to chronic illnesses, and later in life, maybe to more isolation or cognitive changes. And ultimately, it's a big contributor to chronic illnesses later in life. Next slide. And I love this slide because it really summarizes everything, even though we're just starting the talk. It says the body remembers, the bones remember, the joints remember, even the little finger remembers. Memories lodged in pictures and feelings and in the cells themselves. So the reason this is such a touching quote to me is because our bodies do remember these patterns, and it's very possible to heal them. And many of us do heal them throughout our lives by finding excellent relationships, by doing the work that we love to do, and by doing some of the things that I'll be sharing later on in the talk, some tips and strategies. Oops. So next slide, please. A little bit about trauma. The main thing about this slide is that trauma elicits a stress response. It's a threatening experience. A trauma is an experience in which we got stuck. We couldn't heal it. We couldn't get through it. And we felt helpless and we felt alone. And I see a lot of people who've had car accidents and being belted into a car where you can't move because the seatbelt is strapped tightly against your body, but you feel afraid at the same time is kind of a setup for a little trauma. And we do distinguish between little traumas and big traumas. But the key with trauma is that you feel helpless and you felt alone, just to define that. And in our current medical model, we kind of focus on just individual traumas that might happen to me or have happened to me or to you. But I prefer to see that we also have cultural traumas. We have a trauma of the pandemic or a stressor of the pandemic that we're all in a collective. So I like to kind of widen the lens really on how much we share in terms of our joy, and we can also share our sadness or our distress. But the good news is we have a built-in nervous system to handle stress, and our nervous system's also built to handle threat. Next slide. So our nervous system has several branches. Stress and anxiety, and this is really important when we're making behavioral changes towards brain health. Stress and anxiety are built in, they're healthy, and they are adaptive mechanisms, which sometimes become overused and unhealthy. But we have a built-in healthy stress system. Every threatening or frightening life event evokes either a fight, you get angry, or you flee the situation, or you freeze because you don't know what to do. And animals do this in the wild, and we have a lot of data about this fight, flight, or freeze response. But we're also wired to have a feeling of rest, digest, take in the good of just having run a marathon, because that's not true, I don't run marathons. But that restful feeling after you do a big event, you're like, yeah, I can rest and digest right now. We need both. We need flexibility in our nervous systems. Next slide. Thanks. And this is an illustration of the fight or flight. So fight and flight are healthy. We get scared, then we feel relief. We calm down. It's great. Next slide. But some stressors just don't go away. And you could see what I wrote on the bottom of this slide is COVID just didn't go away. And that's the kind of stuff we really need to be dealing with in a daily stress relief protocol. And I hope that after today, you'll come away with some ideas. Next slide. Thank you. So COVID's been one of those big stressors which have not gone away. And we've each chosen, or by default, we've had to deal with it in different ways. And sometimes that stress is just below the surface. But maybe our heart rate has just gone up a little bit, or our heart rate variability has gone down a little bit, or maybe our blood pressure is a little higher, or we're eating differently. But what this slide shows, and it's very simple, but it's from a real scientific paper, which I wanted to share with you. Women suffered more than men in the pandemic in terms of anxiety and depression. And women suffer much more than men with cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. So I really thought that was important to highlight. Even though it looks complicated, it's actually really simple. So during this pandemic, we've had a lot of anxiety and some depression, and there are ways to work with that too. So getting back to, next slide, please. The upside of stress. I just talked about chronic stress, right? With the pandemic, but stress is really important when it's healthy. Remember that our nervous system's here to help us survive, become resilient, deal with challenges. So we really have three kinds of stress. There's eustress, which is kind of exciting. You know, it might be you're just ready to start a race, or you're just ready to kind of read a new book, or you're really motivated to learn something difficult. Eustress is good. It builds our performance and our capacity. And when you're in a coaching group, or when you're in any kind of motivation to get healthier, you want some eustress. That's the good stuff. Hormesis is when you challenge yourself. It's a little uncomfortable, but you're getting somewhere, and it actually makes us stronger. It's distress, the suffering and the emotional challenge that can really bring us into that fight or flight nervous system. Next slide. Thank you. And I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I want you to notice your immediate reaction. Just what's your physical feeling when you see a slide like this? It says, this is your stress response. It affects many physiological systems in our bodies. And this is really a kind of simplified slide of how much stress does do to our bodies. Next slide. And this is what a threat response, a trauma response, or a stressor, and I'm kind of using them interchangeably for the purpose of this talk, but it's what I said is actually inaccurate, because stressors are not trauma. Trauma can become very stressful and prolong stress. But stress, I'm sharing with you, is good if it starts, if it has a middle, and if it ends. But this is a threat response in the brain. You can see that information loops from the front of the brain to the amygdala, which is like an alarm bell, a fire alarm bell that says, okay, do something right now because it's dangerous. And then it moves out to other brain regions, including memory centers. So what we end up storing as a memory is, okay, remember that? That was not a good door to go through. That's where all the rocks were. I fell last time. So that region of the brain connects with memory centers of the brain to tell you, okay, let's track that. Let's not do that dangerous thing again. So again, that's an adaptive mechanism that sometimes goes awry. Next slide. Thank you. So these are the different things that stress does to the body. But again, chronic stress creates inflammation. It changes the memory and emotional centers of our brain. It changes our vascular health. Our blood-brain barrier, that very permeable and complex layer that's supposed to protect our brain, can become leaky. Blood sugar can raise. Chronic stress interferes with sleep, and it increases a very important stress hormone, a glucocorticoid called cortisol. Next slide. This is an important stress hormone, cortisol, because when the body feels stressed, it sends signals to release cortisol. And too much cortisol breaks down tissue. And I guess that's the main point of this slide. Stress impairs our thinking in many ways, but the important part of this slide is that too much cortisol breaks down hippocampal cells. And those of you who know anything about memory or who are learning about memory know that the hippocampus or the hippocampi are very small regions in the brain. They're mirrored, one on each side, very important memory centers. So we definitely know that cortisol can break down that one memory center and other tissues as well and create immune changes. But the interesting part of that is that it can also lead to depression. So cortisol and depression and anxiety also have a relationship. So it's good to know about your own cortisol. Next slide. Thank you. And we make decisions early in our lives about threat and safety. And I have this slide here to just let you know, empower you to know that you can make decisions now too and change things. Our body did develop patterns early on about what made us afraid or made us feel threatened. And I think I'm going to give you a very simple example. I have permission from a client of mine to share this story, but I was working with him in a coaching environment, and he was going to go swimming with his wife because that was a really lovely activity for them to do together. And he was very excited and she was looking forward to it. He had dementia. She didn't. This was something wonderful they could do together. The next week they came back and his wife said to me, he couldn't do it. He just couldn't go swimming. So I looked at him and I said, what happened? And I saw something in his eyes. And what I saw was fear. And I said, wow, what's happening? And I said, what are you looking at? What can you see when you look at the pool? And he said, I could tell he was going back to an old memory. And it was very tender, even as I tell the story. He went to a memory of being bullied when he was 8 years old. And his head was held underwater for a really, really long time. So he didn't feel safe in the pool. And that came back. And luckily, I do trauma treatments, trauma therapies. I'm trained in them. I did some trauma therapy with him, and he was able to swim again because he had released that old memory. So sometimes these old memories can have a way of kind of sneaking in to our lives, especially with food. Actually, I can say that for myself. Our old patterning around nourishment and food behaviors is something that's really worth looking at and healing so that we're eating properly for our health as well. But we also learn from our childhood, am I worth it? Is my health worth it? So incorporating some of these stress reduction strategies and awareness strategies into each and every day will help us and our care partners, if we have a care partner, work with us if we have dementia. Next slide. We can't change our childhood, we can't change our history, but we can always make changes to our current experiences, our responses to those experiences. And this allows us to keep growing through our lifespan and through our health span. We get to share our wounds and then share our recovery. And our pasts can become gifts. Next slide. Thank you. So let's just do a little exercise right now. That was a lot of material. Take note if there's something that you want to note. And I'm going to share with you a little exercise that I do myself as well that really brings us into that parasympathetic nervous system, the calm, safe, rest nervous system. And it's something that you can do before bed. It's something you can do in the morning. I'm going to invite you to just bring your body into a comfortable position, even more comfortable than you just were. Just settle a leg or a foot or an arm. And I'm going to invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable. We're all doing this together, but if you're not comfortable, don't close your eyes. Don't close your eyes if you're driving a tractor. That was a joke. Settle in though, and get a sense of what part of your body might feel most kind of settled, relaxed right now. You can take 2 long and velvety breaths in and out, and settle even more. And then I'm going to invite you to notice an imagination of a very sweet and calm place that you've been before. It could be somewhere from your childhood, it could be somewhere from a recent vacation, or it could be a beautiful field you're near right now, a place that makes you feel really settled and peaceful. And I'm doing this along with you. And as you go to your calm place, imagine where you are. And notice a sense of peace or neutrality even. And you can open your eyes now if your eyes were closed and just kind of take note for a second or two. Take in the good of that experience, if indeed you felt something good from that experience. And that's something that you can do every day. Imagine your calm or safe place. Thanks for doing that with me. Next slide. Thank you. So getting back to some of the material, I just want to talk a little bit about mental health specifically as a risk factor for dementia. A very big new study was just done. As you can see, over 1.5 million people across 30 years were looked at. And just to summarize, there's a very big relationship between mental health, anxiety, and their ability to kind of prompt cognitive decline. And maybe that's through neuroinflammation. Maybe that's the inflammation was there first. Maybe an infection that didn't get diagnosed was there first. I call them latent infections or kind of hidden infections. But we're not really sure how this happens, but I just want to share a little bit about the high risk of having a mental health problem and not taking care of it. Next slide. Thank you. And mental health is what I and my colleagues at Sharp again call a modifiable risk factor. This is something you can do something about. So let's work on it, right? We've got all the tools and treatment strategies, and it's just really important to kind of begin to recognize, this is something that is relatable for me. So next slide, please. Starting with depression, and isn't this the cutest little spring chick you ever saw? It turns out that Alzheimer's and depression are very intertwined. So the question always has been, and I've been running memory clinics for at least 35 years. Even 35 years ago, we saw that people who had dementia often had Alzheimer's. People who were worried they had dementia but didn't often had depression. So it's a very important conundrum to begin to untangle, and thankfully science is beginning to do that. About 1/3 to half the people who have Alzheimer's also have depression, a major depressive disorder. And it turns out people with Alzheimer's disease and depression show more rapid cognitive decline, and they have more of the pathology associated with Alzheimer's disease, which are plaques and tangles, which I'm sure you've heard about in the hippocampus than other regions in the brain, but they have more plaques and tangles than people who don't have depression but still have Alzheimer's disease. So clearly, this depression is a very important thing to tackle, and something that's healing and relieving. And I have many ideas for how to do that and resources. And loneliness is certainly linked with depression. Yeah, you can change the slide. Thank you. When we're depressed, we pull away. When we feel hopeless with COVID, with what's going on in the world, we don't feel connected. When we're told to pull away because of that social distancing, loneliness is so huge. Because going back to, does our nervous system feel safe in this moment? Does our nervous system feel nervous or threatened in this moment? In a way, it's kind of sometimes hard to tell, but sometimes not. But the brain knows, the body knows. And the body treats loneliness as a state of threat. And it responds by activating all of the defensive mechanisms we have in our body, like the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, in which that in turn prompts the immune system to enhance inflammation. That's one pathway by which social isolation can accelerate the progression of Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease has many root causes, and many of them are modifiable. Connection is obviously the easiest way to remedy social isolation and loneliness, but it's not always accessible, simple, especially when it's paired with depression. So that's a whole other talk. Some other remedies. Exercise for stress resilience and brain health. Exercise, next slide, turns out to be a scientific remedy for brain health, but also for depression. So moving your body in these different ways, and I actually had a whole other slide in here that kind of detailed the type of exercising that I like to recommend to my patients. That's from the literature, data-driven, and great for your body health. What's great for your heart, first of all, is great for your brain. But these exercises particularly are good for brain health. Getting your heart rate up, resistance training. It turns out that our muscles talk to our brain and our brain talks to our muscles. Complex balance training is great for brain health. And so is high interval training. That's really when your heart rate gets up, but just for a short time. That's great, but it's not great for people who have moderate or severe dementia, high interval training. It's too much of a strain on the body. So it's good to get someone who knows about exercise and exercise physiology. I might have resources for you for that, but that's really important to be doing all of these different types of exercise to stimulate your brain. And anxiety and Alzheimer's disease, well, the prevalence of anxiety symptoms in Alzheimer's is about 40%. So it can also be a prelude to Alzheimer's. So just like I was telling you, dementia can kind of be a warning that something else is going on, prodromal, we say in the biz, and so can anxiety. So if you have extra anxiety, if you have extra overwhelm, and you're noticing slight changes in cognition, it's really good to see a neuropsychologist, because a psychologist portion of the neuropsychologist would also understand what role cognition is playing with the mental health concern. But developing a good coping and management strategy for anxiety in people with dementia and without dementia is really important. It worsens cognitive deficits, just like depression does. Another modifiable risk factor. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. So this was the anxiety slide. Please go on to the next one, and I'll share a breathing exercise with you. So taking a breath, catching your breath is a really great expression. And I'm just going to invite you to notice your breathing right now, because working with anxiety, there's so many things that you can do for anxiety. Of course, if your doctor recommends medications, that too, but there are also a cajillion other things that you can do for anxiety. I've had anxiety and I have not taken anxiety medications in my life. I used to have anxiety, and there are many things that I did to work with my own anxiety, like moving my body really helps. Sometimes when you match the anxiety with movement, it's great. So people who have anxiety sometimes like to walk a lot or keep moving, and that works with energy in a really positive way. And sometimes just pausing and catching your breath, realizing, you know what? You have control over your breath. That's one thing you can control. And I give you a list here of 4 different types of breathing. A great place to start, though, is just noticing a balloon, that there's a balloon in your belly. That's called diaphragmatic breathing. And there are many more complex breathing styles that I'm happy to share with you at another time. But just slow and long exhales, focusing on the exhale, puts you into that parasympathetic state that tells your body, time to rest and digest, you can relax. Next slide. It turns out that what we think about really matters. A little heads up on some new science about thinking. Negative thinking is linked to poor mental health, which is also linked to poor cognitive health. So it turns out that repetitive negative thinking is linked to dementia in a pretty big study. So working on our thinking and having some control over our negative thinking can help mitigate the chances of us getting cognitive decline, along with a lot of other things that we do. But more importantly, it can make you happier. It can make you feel free, as though you have some agency over your thinking. Next slide. And it's associated with beta amyloid and tau, pathology that happens in the brain. Next slide. This slide just shows that meditation and mindfulness are important to work with our thoughts, because our minds wander almost half of the time we're awake. That's enough for that slide. It's kind of startling, to realize that we don't know what we're thinking about or have control over it or choosing what we think about half of the time. Next slide.
Dr. Rusk?
Yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left, so
I'll be perfect.
I just wanted you to know the time.
Thank you, and I'm tracking, but thank you.
Okay.
That's great. Next slide, please. Great. So there are all of these different types of meditation, and loving kindness meditation is a good one. Next slide. So in healing trauma, we're actually helping our brain. We're not just creating more joy, freedom, health behaviors. We're actually working to do brain health as well. Next slide. Sometimes just developing resources is a great way to start. Maybe think about that beautiful place in nature. I took that picture on the left. That's my favorite place. Maybe just loving a dog and finding something that you really love and makes you feel safe and comfortable, and hanging out with that person or that animal more often. Next slide. Thank you. And creating repair experiences in your life, apologizing to people you haven't apologized to, or forgiving people you haven't forgiven. Next slide. And this is a super complicated slide, because I actually want you to know how complicated the gut-brain connection is and how important it is to study it, to learn more about it, and to get empowered about what's happening in your gut microbiome and how it's sending information to your brain and then back and forth. Next slide. And this is really my last slide. And what I pulled together over the last few years is that people who have brain healthy habits are also stress resilient people. So the shared commonalities are a consistent sleep schedule, and these are your takeaways. Wake up at the same time every morning, even more important than going to sleep at the same time. Move and groove in varied ways, many different ways a day. Walking alone is not enough, but it's great, so don't stop. Eat lots of vegetables and tend to the gut of your garden gut, because there's a lot going on there. And spend time in your garden as well. Process difficult feelings. That's a great way to connect with people and work on yourself. Try to work with your feelings of shame or jealousy or grief, things that are kind of hidden, anger. We all have so many strong feelings now. Gratitude and positivity habits are so important to be engaging in right now, because meaning and connection can be done with all of these activities. A spiritual group or a group that has meaning and purpose for you, connecting with them. I love yoga for brain health and trauma and stress reduction. And again, self-care. So that was my last slide, but the truth is we can do the same things for brain health as we do to build stress resilience. And all of these habits that you see here will support any tendency you have to depression or anxiety. And they'll also be protective for you in terms of your cognition. So I've very much enjoyed talking to you. I do want to leave some time for questions and for answers. Bottom line here is to slow your pace. Now that kind of we've opened up a little bit and COVID has calmed down a little bit, we're recalibrating our nervous systems, our bodies, where we eat, who we see. I'm going to invite you to remember that there's at least 1 or 2 times every day where you turn off the TV or the news, you go into nature, you have a hug with someone who really wants to hug you too, and you let it linger, and you let your nervous system get into a state of peace and relaxation. So I hope that after today, you can make a commitment to just do one or two of those things for your nervous system to heal. And this is something that a patient of mine told me today. I want to share a quote with you. She told me that I wasn't allowed to use her name, but she was very happy to say that she was a patient and a friend of mine. And she's someone who has dementia. And she said, the wholeness we have inside of us is really worth our time. The wholeness we have inside of us is really worth our time. So I encourage all of you. Next slide. Next slide. I encourage all of you to feel like this very budding and beautiful iris and take time for yourselves and make a contract with yourselves to do self-care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rusk, for joining us this evening. And what you spoke about tonight affects and impacts us all. I think especially over the last 2 years, there's not one of us who would say that we didn't feel some anxiety or depression or feeling trapped and not able to go out or see family and friends. And so a lot of these tools are very useful. And, you mentioned that you coach people. I think, people sometimes don't know where to start. And so what are some first steps you think people could take if this is resonating with them, but they're not really sure where to start?
Mm-hmm. I think reading is great. I think your website is great. I have great resources on my website too. There are many online communities, and actually I can compile a list of about 5 websites where people can go. There's some great brain health books too. And I think I have resources on my website, simple ones. I think I really love Dr. Bredesen's new book. There's some really good brain health books, and I'll put them again. I'll compile a list so that you can share them with your community within the next day or two, if that works for you. But I think the simple things to start with are don't eat, try to eat less sugar, try to move your body more, make simple commitments to yourself, become more aware of, is this a comfortable experience for me in my body and in my nervous system? Or am I a little bit, kind of threatened, stressed, not so happy? And keep yourself in situations where your nervous system is happier. I know it sounds simple, but sometimes we actually don't take a moment to look inside. The other easy tip is when you're exercising, go slower. Notice what's happening inside your body, whatever you're doing. So if you're just lifting 2 pounds or if you're lifting 50 pounds, notice what it feels like inside for that muscle to be working. Let it be yours. Kind of own your activities. Same thing when you eat. Do it more mindfully and slowly. Taste more. Those are all things that you can do. And I think working with difficult feelings, especially now, is very important because we hold on to them and it makes kind of us more contracted and tight. And I think that induces a stress response. Anything you can think of, Lisa, in terms of, oh, this is also really important before I go to you. I think we really need to be paying attention to sleep. The sleep, the food, the stress, the when we wake up in the morning, make sure you see a big bright sunlight, or at least you're going outside before 10 in the morning.
I'm glad you mentioned sunlight. I think it's so critical. If you can get out at lunchtime, if you're working, just to get 15 minutes.
Sun. Be in nature. Visit with a tree. Take some time in nature. If that's in Central Park, I think you're in New York. I know you're in New York. For me, I have the foothills. Everybody has a patch of grass and a tree. We are blessed. Slow down. Sorry.
We have another question that I just wanted to see if we could address, which is it possible that after years of self-work, some main issues simply cannot be resolved?
Oh, I love that question. Is that the question?
Yeah.
This is so important. I think that is, you spoke, whoever asked that question, thank you so much. I think we get to a point where work isn't even the right word to use anymore. We need to be softening into acceptance, into self-kindness, into self-compassion. Just, this was rough, and I have so much tenderness for myself. In fact, that loving kindness meditation, another time I could do it with your group, but that's a great meditation for that person, because you offer wishes of wellness and health and kindness to someone else, and you offer it to yourself too. You know, to offer that tenderness of self-compassion. And I love Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion, because that's really the answer to that question for all of us is, oh my God, forgive yourself first before you forgive anyone else. Accept and be tender with yourself. So many of us were taught to work, but not taught to rest. That's part of it.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that. And yes, Kristen Neff is a wonderful place to start,
Yeah,
to read about self-compassion.
that's right.
Someone wrote that they joined commune.com, I think it is. Great meditation, a 10-day course on meditation.
Yeah, great. There's so many good resources. You know, a free great resource with tons of meditations. I also have some meditations on my website. I add them from time to time. If you want to check that out, but nothing compares to Insight Timer. If you know Insight Timer, it's a very good source for guided meditations. So I recommend that our listeners check out Insight Timer as well.
Great, thank you for that.
And you know, not everyone likes to meditate. I think prayer does the same most wonderful thing for spiritual fitness that meditation does. I personally do both, and they're very different and they're very similar. And another talk, I've actually given a talk on this. There's a whole field called, you know, neurotheology, and it's good for your brain. It really creates spiritual fitness in your brain. So I encourage those kinds of meditation practices every day. And again, I'm just going to leave all of you with my simple final words are, make it doable, put it into your everyday, make it manageable, and notice your successes. Notice when you've really done something that you feel good about, even if it's small. And that means meditation or exercise, all of them. Routine is really good. I'm sure you teach about that too, right, Lisa?
Yes, very well. And you spoke about sleep routine, very important.
Yeah.
But yeah, that can help to ground us and make us feel very good about ourselves. So
Yeah.
I want to thank you. We're getting some very positive feedback in the chat, and I really think everyone benefited so much. I know I did from hearing you talk. I learned some new things, as always. So thank you very much.
So happy to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for your gentleness.
Oh, that makes me feel so good. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Sleep well, everyone.
I'm going to stop recording.
I'd like you to save the chat if you can. Do you know how to do that?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.